to expand his power. His name was Huey Long, and he was the governor of Louisiana between 1928 and 1932, and a U.S. senator afterwards. Many called Huey Long a dictator, and many still do so today. But it can't be denied that Huey Long got things done, and he was also a champion of the poor, and they loved him for it. He modernized Louisiana through unprecedented public works programs that predated the New Deal. He provided free school books to students, promoted night schools that went a long way in decreasing the state's illiteracy rate, especially for African Americans. He invested in state universities, supported poor farmers, abolished the poll tax, and was an early backer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, ensuring FDR got Southern support for the Democratic nomination before breaking with him later, accusing the president of not doing enough to help the people during the Great Depression. He was poised to challenge FDR in the 1936 election, but was assassinated in 1935. Today we're going to be in conversation about the life and times of Huey Long. My guest for this is Robert Mann. Robert Mann holds the let me say that again, because this has changed. Robert Mann is a retired professor of mass communication at Louisiana State University, and he is the author of the book Kingfish U, Huey Long and LSU. Robert Mann, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you, Mitch. It's a delight to be with you today.
I appreciate you and your patience for sitting through my sort of long introduction there. I just thought it mattered, and it was important to try to get into the complexities of Huey Long, because often when I hear about Huey Long throughout my entire political reporting career, it's always been in a very negative way, that he was someone who very much abused his power, which was true and which we'll talk about. And you hear a lot of comparisons also between Huey Long and Donald Trump. What you don't hear as often, though, is the things he actually got done and what he meant for the state of Louisiana itself and modernizing it over time.
Oh, that's absolutely right. He did get a lot done. He was an authoritarian and maybe a dictator. And it is that those two parts of his record that give historians and others such heartburn in trying to assess him, because it's hard to deny the success. It's hard to deny the accomplishments, the legacy of those accomplishments. One of the reasons why I wrote this book about his role at LSU was, number one, I think it's a rip-roaring, rollicking story. It's just cinematic in its outrageousness in a lot of ways. But there's also a major university in this state that has been in many ways the bedrock of higher education in Louisiana for over 100 years, and that is largely its prominence and its success, whatever its success has been, is largely because Huey Long took an interest in it and built it up. So while people, critics, and still today in Louisiana, you still can find a lot of people you can have a vigorous debate about Huey Long.
You can today,
and in other places, but I think it's impossible to deny some of his accomplishments. It's also impossible to deny the damage that he did to our democratic system here in Louisiana, the legacy of that. And I think it's all of that and more that makes him such an interesting and compelling political figure. I think, other than in my writing, I've written a number of books on Lyndon Johnson, and I'm now beginning to write my third book on the Long family. I think Long, other than Lyndon Johnson, to me, Huey Long is the most fascinating American politician, certainly of the 20th century.
Just over your shoulder on the video, you have a framed political poster of Senator Russell Long. Mm-hmm. You worked for Russell Long. Who was Russell Long?
I did. I was his press secretary his last 2 years in office in the mid 80s. He was the elder son of Huey Long. He was 16 years old when his father was assassinated. And 2 weeks later, after his father's death, he enrolls as a freshman at Louisiana State University and becomes freshman class president, eventually becomes student body president. He quickly is pulled into the political campaigns of the Long organization his uncle Earl, Huey's brother, runs for governor in 1948 and actually ran for governor in 1940. And in both those campaigns, Russell was pulled into those campaigns to sort of be the living embodiment of Huey Long and to testify to the people that still worship Long, his disciples, that this man Russell Long, my uncle Earl, is the bearer of the torch of my dead father. And then Russell gets Earl elected, helps Earl get elected in 1948, briefly goes to work for him, and then launches a campaign for the U.S. Senate and gets elected to the U.S. Senate in the fall of 1948 at age 29, and has to wait a few weeks to take office because he's not old enough to become a U.S. senator, and then serves for 38 years in the Senate. And I was privileged to go to work for him toward the end of his time. And then after he retired and I went to work for his successor, John Breaux, on the side, I worked with him for about 4 years and wrote an authorized biography of him. So that, part of that story is that the Huey Long, the Long organization, the Longs of Louisiana stayed in power for a long time in this state. There were a lot of brothers and cousins and nephews, Long family people who dominated the state's politics for the rest of the 20th century.
How did Russell Long talk about his father? And you're also close to sort of his family.
Yes.
The Long family. How does the family look? I mean, again, Huey Long is one of the most controversial figures of the 20th century. How does his own family look back at him today? Or how did Russell Long look back at him when he was alive?
Well, Senator Long, Russell Long was as I said, he was 16 years old when his dad died, and and his father was a very active politician. So it's kind of a sad story, I always thought, because he would talk about his father with such fondness, but most of what he knew about his father came from people that who knew, friends or associates or his uncle Earl, people who knew about his father, and told him those stories. So a lot of times what he knew about Huey was from other people, which was really kind of sad. He told me the story one time about this was maybe when he was 14 or 15. He and his father went to see a movie across the street from the Roosevelt Hotel in New Orleans, where Huey's headquarters were, where he lived in New Orleans for most of the time, where he operated out of. And there was a theater across the street, and he said they went across the street to watch this movie, and Russell said he got engrossed in the movie, and he looked up, finally looked to his side, and he realized his father had just gotten up and left, had remembered something he needed to do, and got up and left him. And he finished the movie and then walked back over and found his father at work in his office. And I said, did that bother you? That your father did that? And he said, no, it didn't. He said, I knew he was a busy man and all that, but I knew it had to have an impact. And it was just, to me, it was it's kind of a sad story, but he worshiped his father, and he saw part of his life's work rehabilitating his father's image. And when I went to work for him in January of 1985, that was the 50th anniversary. That was September of that year was the 50th anniversary of his father's assassination shot on September 8th, 1935 in the Louisiana State Capitol. And he said to me 2 or 3 months after I went to work for him, he said, I got to give this speech in the Senate on September 10th, the day my father died, on the 50th anniversary. Can you write me a speech? And I remember saying, Senator, there's just no way. That is such a personal endeavor. There's just no way I can write a speech for you about your father. I didn't really know him that well at that time. I said, but I said, I'm pretty good at asking questions as a journalist. Why don't I interview you, and we'll take the transcripts, and I can massage your what you say about your father. I can massage that into a speech. And so we spent about 3 months. We would just schedule time where I'd go over and interview him for an hour or two about his father, and just sort of methodically work my way through his father's life and career and his impact on Louisiana and national politics. And then I took the transcript of that and helped him turn it into this speech that he gave on the Senate floor on September 10th of '85. And it was I think I was 25 or 26, 27 at the time. It was in my, my mid 20s. And I remember thinking, this may be the coolest job for a Louisiana political junkie. I would be paying this man to sit here and do this work. Instead, he's paying me. And it was just such a privilege. It was just such an incredible privilege to begin my time working for this guy. They were just part of my job was just to sit around and talk about Huey Long with his son. There was just an enormous amount of affection and a feeling that his father was misunderstood and that his father didn't get to finish his work and that his father was was a man in a hurry and who somehow he always thought his father didn't really feel like he would live a long time, and that's why why he worked so hard, so furiously, cut many ethical took ethical shortcuts and crashed through norms and maybe even broke laws because he didn't think he had a lot of time. I think he felt like his father had a premonition that he would be assassinated. And Senator Long always told me, he said, my dad didn't think he had a long time to live and had to do things in a hurry. He had to be a revolutionary. He said, I've always had the sense that I had a long time, that I could be more of an evolutionary, that I could get a lot of the same things done, but with using different methods, taking my time and working through the system, not smashing the system.
Huey Long was born on August 30th, 1893, near the town of Winfield in I guess is north central Louisiana. What's important to know about Huey Long and in his early life? Does he come from a family of wealth? Again, this is a man who would be a champion of the poor in his political career. Where does he come from? What's his background?
Well, so he like a lot of politicians of that era, they all wanted their followers to think they were born in a log cabin and came from incredible poverty. Long did not come from poverty. He lived in a fairly remote town. Winfield's still fairly remote, but it was a small town in north central Louisiana. His father was a fairly, not a rich man, but a fairly prosperous man, maybe one of the more prosperous people in Winfield, a farmer, owned a lot of timber land and that kind of thing. Huey grew up in probably the largest house in Winfield. So he was not poor. The Long family could afford to send most of its children to college. Huey always said he didn't go to college because his family couldn't afford to send him there. And in my research for Kingfish U, I determined that was not the case, that he just didn't have the patience for sitting through 4 years of college courses. But one thing about Winfield, I think the thing that part of Louisiana, the Winfield and North Louisiana, North Central Louisiana, is that its history, its economy, its politics were not shaped by the Civil War in the same way that the downcountry parts of Louisiana and other places in the South were shaped. In other words, this was not the part of Louisiana that had these large cotton plantations that had huge slave holdings, huge farms of slave holdings. Not that there weren't slaves in North Louisiana, but the huge cotton plantations were along the major rivers, along the Red River, along the Mississippi River. And Winfield was nowhere near those two. It was up country, it was hilly land, more about farming, more about timber farming and small holding kind of farming, subsistence farming than big, cotton plantations. So the people in Winfield, so Winfield is in the parish. In Louisiana, our counties are called parishes. Yeah. Louisiana is in Wynn Parish, but it is surrounded by parishes that are named after Union people. Right north of two parishes north of just a 30-minute drive from an hour drive from Winfield is Lincoln Parish. Not far from Lincoln Parish, not far from Winfield, where Huey was born, is Grant Parish. There's Union Parish. This was
so when you say Union, you mean sort of like referring to the Civil War, the Union.
The Union,
yeah.
Yes. this part of Louisiana did not support the Civil War. In fact, some stories about Winfield were when Louisiana seceded from the Union, that the people of Winfield voted not to secede from the Union. They did not support the Civil War, and this is not uncommon. There were a lot of parts of other southern states, eastern Tennessee, voted against seceding from the Union. Again, sort of the upcountry, non-big plantation parts of these states were not gung ho for the Civil War because they weren't really defending slavery. That there wasn't as much slavery. Their economy didn't depend on it as much as the big plantations did, and they saw the war as the rich man's war, defending the slave economy of this state, and that it had really not much in it for them. And so Huey comes along, born in the 1890s, not long after the Civil War had ended. The remnants of the Civil War were still, had still wrecked the South. Were still suffering in the South, and places that had, immense poverty and deprivation, like Wynn Parish. The people of that parish recognized that the war was the failure of the South in the Civil War was a big part of their suffering and their woes. But they didn't always see that they were victims of this quote unquote northern aggression. They saw themselves as victims of the avarice, the selfishness, the greed of the big planters downstate. And so that's kind of the milieu that Huey Long comes from. That the rich people, the wealthy interests of this state, have run us into the ground. Their greed is the reason people suffer. And by the way, that's still very much a strong strain in American politics today, right? That's Bernie Sanders' message. Bernie Sanders and Huey Long would have had a lot to talk about. And
do you find similarities in their?
Oh, absolutely. Huey comes to power running against the big corporations. He comes to power working to smash Standard Oil, the big oil giant in the state, to tax them, bring them to heel. They try to impeach him. They almost do impeach him.
Like in his first year as governor, or
yeah, well,
right?
Second year, second year, 1929, and so he comes to power, and I think he made the political calculation that a lot of politicians do, is that there's some politicians make the calculation, I want to go court those in power. I want to go court the big corporate interests and take their money and use that money to run for political office. And then there are people like Long who say, the route I'm going to take is attack those corporate interests, make them, point to them as the enemy, point to them as the reason that we're all suffering, and do something about it. And he took that route. He was audacious in his attacks on the big moneyed interests in the state, not just the oil industry, but other big moneyed interests. And he tapped into something. He tapped into that that agrarian unrest. This was right before the Great Depression hit, but it was still, Louisiana was one of the interesting things about Louisiana is that Louisiana didn't really feel the effects of the Great Depression, and so a lot of other southern states didn't as well because they were already poor.
Yeah.
It didn't really, they didn't have a whole lot further to go down. So there was a lot of suffering. There was a lot of just a lot of poverty and lack of education, lack of opportunity, and people resented that. And Long pointed to what he thought and what a lot of people thought were the villains of this story, and those were the big moneyed interests of the state.
Standard Oil, as you said, is the power at the time, extremely powerful. It eventually would be broken up and into many of the main oil companies we recognize today, at least the American ones. How did his fight with Standard Oil shape him?
Well, it resulted eventually in, as you mentioned earlier, the impeachment in 1929. Standard Oil and sort of helped coalesce, probably bribed and bought off a lot of members of the House and some in the Senate to support the impeachment of Long, to get him out of office, because he was He was attacking them. He was taxing them. Um, and he beat the impeachment. The House voted to impeach him, and then it went to a Senate trial. And before the trial begins, he managed to get 15 senators to sign what's called a round robin, a letter saying that under no circumstances would they vote to convict him. And so the impeachment just collapsed at that point. But it radicalized him, and I think it made him realize, at least he said, that I think I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, I before the impeachment, I used to ask politely for what I wanted, and now I bulldoze them out of my way. I think he realized that there was no way to play the politics in a conventional way if you wanted to overthrow the oligarchy. If you wanted to at least diminish the power of those big moneyed interests, there was no way to do it in a polite, nice, conventional way. There was no way to do it by playing their game. You had to smash them. And so it really radicalized him. And I think one of the things, I don't know whether he had those authoritarian instincts to begin with or not. He may have. It may have ended in the same way regardless. But I think that I think he realized that the only way I'm going to do what I need to do is by controlling every lever by seizing every lever of power I can, and by controlling the state from top to bottom. I'm not justifying it. I'm not saying it was the right thing to do. The way I always describe, when I talk about him and LSU, I usually say he did the most amazing things using the wrong methods possible. I mean, he did amazing work, incredible accomplishments, but did it in the worst possible way. But you can't. But in most cases, you just can't deny the accomplishments.
This is Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. We are in conversation about the lifetimes and politics of Huey Long. My guest is Robert Mann. Robert Mann is the author of the book Kingfish U, Huey Long and LSU. I do want to, and I gave in the introduction sort of a long list of, and we can go on all day about the things that Huey Long actually did for Louisiana, and many of these things actually to support the poor people of Louisiana. But I do want to follow up, and I have to, I want to follow up on the means he employed to get there, to get to the destination, and what were some of these things. But also, when I was preparing for our conversation, Robert Mann, I did think to myself, and this also isn't to defend, doing things illegally or outside the proper bounds of how a democracy should work, which he did. Yet we do know in a democracy how incredibly difficult it is to almost get anything done.
Right.
And it would be hard to believe that long list that I read in the introduction of all the things he did for the state could have been achieved any other way.
I mean, that was certainly the point that Russell Long made to me on numerous occasions, in defending his father. And it's the part of his career that I struggle with, because I think there is some merit to saying that that conventional politics were just not going to work in that era. That the oligarchy, the Bourbons, as they were called in those days, they were not going to give up. They were just not going to give up power. And I think Long understood that if the power structure of any place, any state, that people just don't give it up. That it's got to be taken from them. And so I think that. Today, most people, I think, would look at him and say, "My God, that's appalling." I mean, he look at all these bills, look at this dictatorship he created in Louisiana. He went way too far. He turned into a dictator. He was vindictive in ways, and he broke laws and broke rules, and he did everything almost everything you can say about him would be accurate.
What were some of these things that you think demonstrate that the most?
Well, so one of the, I'm working on another book about sort of the post-Long era in Louisiana politics. And I came across this letter the other day in the archives that Jimmy Noe, who was temporarily the governor he was sort of the acting governor, but he was governor for a few months in 1936, before the duly elected governor had taken office. I found this letter he wrote to the sheriff of Rapides Parish, which is in central Louisiana, telling the sheriff that he was now free to hire his own sheriff's deputies, that the state wouldn't have to, that the governor wouldn't have to approve who his sheriff's deputies were. And that's the degree to which Long and the governor of Louisiana, the Long organization governors, that's the degree to which the governors had control over the hiring and firing of every school teacher in the state, municipal officials in the state, sheriff's deputies. It was almost a total dictatorship.
Didn't state employees have to contribute a certain amount of money to?
And right, and I'm glad you mentioned that. So at least during election season, I don't think it happened. It was just constant. But in the months leading up to the elections, state employees were encouraged and really required to contribute 5 to 10% of their salary to the Long organization for its campaign fund. It was called the deduct, and there was a Long organization newspaper called the Progress, and businesses, state employees, and other organizations were also encouraged to take subscriptions to that newspaper, and some were encouraged to take 10 or 12 subscriptions to that newspaper. And so they financed their activities largely through deducting state money from the salaries of the people that who hired and whose jobs depended on them staying in the good graces of the Long organization. So if you wanted to be a teacher, if you wanted to work for the highway department, if you wanted to be a sheriff's deputy, you had to be a Long organization person. It's just like in communist China. If you want to have a good government job, you better be a member of the Communist Party. In Louisiana, if you want to have a good government job, you better be a member of the Long organization. You better contribute to that organization. So, I mean, there's just no way in a democratic society, in an ethical and good government, there's no way that anybody who believes in good government could or would or should defend that. I mean, I would never try to defend that. I think it was horrible. It was illegal. It was authoritarian. It was a virtual dictatorship. The thing that people don't, I think people who criticize it, I think you're obligated to some extent to say, okay, well, yes, that's true. That's true. So how would you have done it? What should Huey Long have done? How should the oligarchy have been broken? And it's hard to prove a counterfactual, and people would say, well, they just should have had better messaging. They just should have campaigned more. They should have, everything that we would say that an ethical politician would do. But there were politicians who had tried that before. It wasn't like Huey Long was the first reformer. It wasn't like Huey Long was the first person who tried to challenge the oligarchy. He was just the first one that actually did it, and the only reason that he did it was that he employed methods that the rest of them were too scared, too timid to do. Again, I'm not saying that it was the right thing to do, but I'm saying that you can't deny that in some ways, not every way, but in some ways he did do what he set out to do, and then in many ways he made life better for the people of the state in ways that the people before him had tried and failed, and the people before him who control the government never even tried to do. And the accomplishments just, I think, speak for themselves in many cases. Now, I will say this. I think it's also important to acknowledge that he only took it so far. He was only governor for about, he had a 4-year term, but he ran for governor in 1930. So he gets elected governor in 1928. He runs for U.S. Senator in 1930. And by early 1932, he leaves Washington abandons the governor's office and goes and leaves for Washington and becomes a U.S. senator. So he really was only governor for 3 years. So,
but as senator, it's oftentimes said he still was pulling the strings in Louisiana.
He was. Oh, clearly he was. He had a puppet governor, and he ran the state. That's why he gets shot in 1935. He's a U.S. senator, but he's down there in the legislature. The legislature said he calls the legislature into special session. He's running the whole show.
He calls a special session of legislature as senator.
Well, he orders his governor to do, his puppet governor to do it. But everybody knows it's Huey Long running things. But more and more from 1932, even though he keeps his eye on the state and he's down here a lot running things, he's focusing on national politics more and more. So a lot of what he wanted to do just didn't get accomplished. There were even if he had not been interested in the U.S. Senate, there was you could only serve in those days. Louisiana governors could only serve a 4-year term. You couldn't run for re-election. You couldn't serve consecutive terms at least. And so, for example, when the Great Depression hits, Louisiana Long never proposed, never enacted any kind of public welfare program, and that was one of the big criticisms of the Roosevelt administration, that you didn't have a system of public welfare. There was an old age pension. There were other, the federal assistance that came to Louisiana needed to be matched by some state funding. And the Roosevelt administration said, we're not just going to give you this money if the state doesn't pony up some money of its own. And it was the federal government that eventually forced Louisiana to contribute. It wasn't Long's idea. Long pushed Roosevelt in some ways, be more aggressive on Social Security and that kind of thing. But I think Long also can be criticized for not doing as much as maybe he could, or maybe as much as legend sometimes suggests that he did.
Yeah, the legend is that Huey Long pushed FDR towards the left.
Well, I think he did. Certainly on Social Security, I think he did. Long thought that Roosevelt proposes and passes Social Security, but it was not, at least in the early days, Social Security was not envisioned. Roosevelt and his people did not envision Social Security to be an income transfer program. They saw it as, we're going to build a trust fund, and then when we have enough money, we'll pay for it. We'll start, contributing. And I think Long, because of his experience in Louisiana, when he started building roads and bridges to try to, when he attacked the infrastructure deficiency in the state, which was massive, there were other governors who tried to build roads. There were other governors who realized that Louisiana needs a modern system of roads, but no governor had tried to do it any other way than just pay as you go. We'll pass some taxes, and if we can raise $10 million, we'll build $10 million worth of roads. And Huey said, no, we need hundreds of millions of dollars worth of roads, and we're going to do it by selling state bonds. We're going to go into debt to do this thing. And people at the time thought that was outrageous. That was just fiscally irresponsible. He was going to bankrupt the government. And Huey said, there's just no way we're going to be able to do this unless we go into debt, and go into a lot of debt to do it. And I think he took that philosophy to Washington and looked at Social Security and other things and said, look, if we want to help poor people, we want to help elderly people who are suffering, they can't wait for 5-10 years to start getting these benefits. We need to do it now. And so we need to start paying this money to them today, not next year, not next decade. And so that's where I think he was influenced by his success in Louisiana, by recognizing that the deficit spending, that debt is a good thing, especially in times of recession or depression.
Was he influenced by such economists as Keynes, or did he have politics? Was there a political philosophy to Huey Long?
So I'm sure there was, and I've never really gotten too much into what kind of the political philosophers that he was paying attention to. I don't think this was so much about economic policy that he was influenced by as just practical necessity, that the only way to do this is to borrow money, and that pay as you go just as a failure. It has not worked. It's not building roads. It's not doing anything. And so, selling bonds was certainly not a Huey Long idea. The idea of bonded indebtedness it was just, there were other states that I think were doing some of that. So I think he was more maybe copying what some other states were doing, and what what was becoming a growing practice among states, which especially during the Depression, was that we got to put people to work, and we can't generate this revenue any other way. We can't tax people who have no income. So we got to find other ways to raise this revenue, and bonded indebtedness was a natural way, and it still is. It's a way that Louisiana still and other states still raise money to do big public works projects.
Huey Long was an early supporter of Franklin Roosevelt for the Democratic nomination. I'm assuming this is incredibly important because this is a time when the South is still a Democratic stronghold. FDR is from New York, so he's a Northerner. So having Huey Long back you for the nomination, I suspect, is a big deal. But they would have a falling out. I remember many years ago having FDR's grandson, Curtis Roosevelt, in the studio. And, I remember the disdain he talked about Huey Long in that interview. And he sounded like FDR. He had the same accent. He called him a demagogue. And FDR would come to very much just like Huey Long as well. Huey Long was poised to challenge FDR for the Democratic nomination. And he started a campaign called the Share the Wealth campaign.
Share Our Wealth, yes.
Share Our Wealth campaign. Mm-hmm. What was the Share Our Wealth campaign?
Well, it was Long. This is the most radical part of Long's ideology that he took. It was his national campaign. He created the Share Our Wealth societies around the country.
It's important.
Giving national radio talks.
And I'm just thinking it's important, the difference. I said share the wealth, but share our wealth is sort of indicating that this is all of our wealth that's being accumulated. That's
right. He believed that it was, exactly. So the basics of this plan was that the rich people have too much, and they need to be. There's all this massive accumulation of wealth. It's the same conversation we're having today in a way. That the top 1% have a massive percentage of inordinate percentage of the wealth of the nation, and Long would probably be shocked at the accumulation of wealth that we have today, because it was it's worse today than it was in Long's time. But Long said that we should tax. He wanted there to be a 100% tax on all earnings above $1 million. He wanted socialists and other liberals in the state who want to eliminate the idea of the billionaires shouldn't be allowed to exist. Huey Long would be right there with them. He would have said, absolutely, we should tax it at 100%. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, today it would be radical to say we should tax the wealth above $1 million at 30%. Huey Long wanted to tax it at 100%, and it was very popular. I mean, it was just such a best of times, worst of times in this country. People saw the Rockefellers and the other rich robber barons living these lifestyles that were unimaginable to the common man, and he just believed. And it was an unworkable plan. It never would have passed. There were the robber barons owned enough members of Congress that was never going anywhere. But it was just enormously popular, as you might imagine. And there were these Share Our Wealth societies were springing up all over the country. And Long would get on national radio and talk about it. He'd get on the Senate floor and talk about it, and it was catching on, and it was a real threat to Roosevelt. I think he thought that if Long wanted to run for president in 1936, that he might damage him enough in the primary, in the nomination process. That it could cripple him going into the 1936 elections. I don't think Roosevelt ever thought that he would not get Long could deny him the nomination, because there weren't, wasn't the kind of party primary process that we have today.
Roosevelt party bosses still.
Yeah, he was not going to wrest the nomination from Franklin Roosevelt. But what Roosevelt was worried about, and what I think Long was really up to, was that he was planning on running as a third party candidate in 1936, thinking that if he runs as a third party candidate, that he could draw enough votes away from Roosevelt to deny him re-election, and that Long would run as the savior of the Democratic Party in 1940 and become president. So I think Long had sort of thought that this is a 5 or 6 year project here to become president. It's not gonna happen for me in 1936, but I can get rid of Franklin Roosevelt. That's what his son Russell thought he was up to, and I think by I think he probably by November or December, January, November, December of 1935 or January 1936, Long might have announced for president. But as we know, he didn't live that long.
Share Our Wealth societies. These are groups that are, as you said, are popping up all over the country. So this becomes a national movement now. This is not just a Louisiana or even a Southern.
It becomes a national movement, and it's built around the legislation that Long introduces in the Senate, these bills to tax wealth and share it, guarantee every person, use that wealth, tax all this wealth over $1 million, and then use that wealth to buy everybody a home and it was a chicken in every pot kind of campaign, that we're going to tax this wealth, and the poor people of this country are going to get that wealth. We're going to give it to you, and we're going to make sure that you have the bare necessities enough to survive. And this is in 1934, 1935, when the Depression was in its darkest days, and so you can only imagine how much that message resonated among people out around the country who were suffering.
And then Huey Long in 1935 is assassinated. What's important to know about his assassination?
Well, it probably, Russell Long always thought that Roosevelt had something to do with it. I don't think he did. I think it was, my conclusion, and I'm not a scholar of the assassination, but I've studied it enough to believe I'm pretty confident that it was really that Long was assassinated because of a local Louisiana political dispute, not because Roosevelt was holding any. Let's just say this: I don't think there was a tear shed in the White House when Huey Long died. He was a huge problem. Roosevelt called him the second most dangerous man in America. Douglas MacArthur being number one. That's for a discussion another day, I know, but why Douglas MacArthur was so dangerous. But Huey was assassinated by a Baton Rouge doctor, ear, nose, and throat doctor, who's named Carl Weiss, whose father-in-law was a judge in Opelousas, Louisiana, which is about an hour west of Baton Rouge, who was an anti-Long, and Long was in that special session that Long had called. Long was going to gerrymander that. He'd been trying to beat this guy, this Judge Pave. He'd been trying to beat this judge for years, and he couldn't. His political organization wasn't as strong in St. Landry Parish, where Opelousas is, and so Long was just going to gerrymander him out of just redraw the district, just gerrymander him out of his district. And there's some suggestion that Long also made a racial slur at Weiss's wife, Judge Pave's daughter, Yvonne, suggesting that she had there was black blood. She was biracial, and you can only imagine in the Deep South in 1935 that was about as severe an insult and slur as you could make against a white person. And so Weiss reportedly goes to the Capitol on that night with a gun and waits for Long to come down a hallway, steps out from behind a column and shoots him in the abdomen. And Long's bodyguards riddle Weiss with bullets, and Long dies about 60 or 70 hours later.
Was Huey Long a racist?
I believe he was, in the sense of he was a conventional politician. He was not you'll find his speeches littered with the N-word, where he makes it clear that he is not for any kind of civil rights legislation. He's not for black people being able to vote. But where he was different in among Southern politicians, that he wasn't an active race baiter. He didn't feel like he needed to foment racial animosity to get elected. He hated the Ku Klux Klan, and he campaigned against the Ku Klux Klan.
Why? What was his hatred of the Ku Klux Klan?
Well, I think part of it was political because the Klan was very anti-Catholic, and so Louisiana is very heavily Catholic, at least South Louisiana. So I think it was partly a political thing. But also the Klan was the strength of the Klan was in a part of the state that was very anti-Long. So I think he associated the Klan with anti-Longism too, and so he just never liked the Klan. And by the time he began attacking the Klan, the influence of the Louisiana Klan was kind of diminishing. So the political upside was greater than the political downside of attacking the Klan in those days, I think. But what's undeniable is that the roads and bridges, the schools, the school books, the hospitals, the public infrastructure that Long built, the public, all of that served white people and black people. It wasn't just for white people.
It wasn't segregated?
It was segregated, but the roads weren't, the bridges weren't, the school books were, all of that was available to black people. Now, I mean, the criticism that I have of Long when it comes to education, for example, is that he didn't really do much for, he didn't do much for them. And when it came to education, when Long became governor, there were only four-year black high schools in the whole state. A decade later, after the Long organization had been running Louisiana for 10 years, there were only 9. They didn't put a lot of money into black education. So that's one of my main criticisms of him, is that I think he gets more credit for being sort of a not a civil rights leader, but being an open, broad-minded man. When I think he didn't see a lot of. I think if it would have taken being an active racist like a Herman Talmadge or a Theodore Bilbo to get elected, I think he would have done it. But he didn't do it because he was enlightened. I think he did it because he didn't need to.
He didn't need to.
And it would have distracted him and maybe made his job a little harder. But I think he was, like most Southern politicians at the time, he was a pretty, standard Southern white supremacist.
I have read that Huey Long could make almost anyone laugh. And I want to ask you about that, because when I think about, and again, there's been a lot of comparisons in recent years between Huey Long and Donald Trump. One comparison that sort of sticks for me is Donald Trump's funny. Whether you may not think so if you absolutely hate him, but when I watch and I listen to his campaigns, I feel there are moments where I'm like, this sounds like a stand-up comedy show. Mm-hmm. His delivery, the way he does it, the way he talks, the way he riffs on things. I feel like I could be watching Dave Chappelle, one of the great comics of the day when I'm listening to Donald Trump. And I think we underestimate the appeal that humor has in politics when people can make other people laugh. Am I correct in at least saying that Huey Long was funny?
Yeah, Long liked playing the buffoon, kind of like playing the bumpkin. He was an amazing code switcher. He wasn't well educated, but he was incredibly smart, and he knew how to. He was just a brilliant mind. So he could, when he was on the Senate floor, you'll notice if you read his speeches on the Senate floor, his grammar is perfect. His thought process is this is not a simple mind. But when he's on the stump in rural Louisiana, he suddenly becomes a bumpkin, and he talks the way that these people talk. He could talk to an audience in South Louisiana, a predominantly Cajun Catholic audience in South Louisiana, in a completely different way than he would talk to them in North Louisiana when it was rural Protestant. So he's an incredible code switcher, and he also knew the kind of humor that people wanted to hear. Your listeners might want to go just on YouTube and listen to him speak to the little Congress in Washington in 1930, I think 34, when he gives a really incredible speech talking about low papal hirum and high papalorum. It's a great, I think it's called the Great Barbecue. And it's this sort of down home speech about how that the Mellons and the Rockefellers have spread out this big barbecue of this lavish dinner, and he paints an incredible image of this vast wealth, but pictures it at a barbecue, and it's a hilarious story about how we've got to run these guys off, and the barbecue's ours. We're going to eat that barbecue. And he has this, I'm not even coming close to doing it justice, but it's hilarious, and it's vivid, and it's skillful, and it's memorable in a way that I think he understood humor as a way to not only get people laughing, but to get people to remember what he said, to paint a picture of who he was attacking and what he was attacking. He was really good at giving. This is a very Trumpian thing. He was very good at attacking his people by giving them names. Crooked Joe Biden or whatever. When Long runs for the United States Senate in 1930, he runs against this guy, the incumbent. His name was Joseph Ransdell, and he was older than Long, but he wasn't an ancient man. But Long starts calling him Feather Duster Ransdell, and it just stuck, and it was sort of they pictured this man as an old, decrepit, out of touch, mentally diminished person. And he called him Feather Duster. And it was just, after a while, everybody knew when he said Feather Duster, they knew it was Joseph Ransdell. He ridiculed him and ran him out of office. And so he was very good at coming up with funny names to ridicule his opponents. I think that the difference in Long and Trump when it comes to humor is that Long's humor was more sophisticated. Long would tell stories. Long would tell jokes. He would sort of create these parables in his speeches. I'm not sure Trump does as much of that. Trump is more a jester, and Long could play the jester. But I think Long's humor was more sophisticated and had more of was driving more to a point than sometimes what I see in Trump. But I think they both did understand not only the value of humor, but the value of entertainment. That people come to these rallies not because they want to hear about your policy proposals. They want to be entertained. They want to go away feeling like they got their money's worth, quote unquote money's worth. And Long gave them their money's worth. It was entertainment, and it was entertainment. Long would also hire bands to play music, to entertain the audience before. Hire these hillbilly bands or whatever, and Cajun bands in South Louisiana. So when you came to a Long rally, you were going to get a good solid hour of really good entertainment, a really good entertaining speech, and some good music.
Robert Mann has joined us for a conversation about the life and times and politics of Huey Long. Robert Mann is a retired professor of mass communication at Louisiana State University, a university that was made into this powerhouse by Huey Long. Robert Mann is the author of the book called Kingfish U, Huey Long and LSU. Robert Mann, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Mitch, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today